Welcome back, gods, gladiators, and Empire or Amazon's students. I'm happy you're back. I'm happy to get to talk to you today about government and social groups in ancient Athens. So just some behind the scenes facts. It has been a week since I filmed, Zoom videoed the last set of lectures, and then we had a week of school. So I'm feeling a little bit rusty, feeling a little bit off my game, but I think it's going to be fine. I think I will get back on track very quickly. And I imagine for some of you, you're just watching these videos back to back, so there's no time change. So I just thought I'd let you know what some of the metadata was. But anyhow, last time we ended our discussion of the foundations of Athens by talking about the Persian Wars and how the Persian Wars basically created the conditions in which Athens was truly able to thrive. A lot of that was absolutely what I said, which is kind of ideological. But practically speaking, a lot of it was also very practical. And a big part of it was that Athens was able to extract a lot of money from the city-states around it through its victories. And so that is a really interesting part of Athenian history, the kind of empire building that Athens does in the 5th century through various tactics, the way it kind of coerces labor and money from the peoples around it. That is not something we are going to be talking about at all because it's a huge topic and just to be completely honest, it's one I find very repugnant to talk about, and I also don't know that much about it. It's just not something I've ever focused on. And because this is a more narrow focused class, I feel comfortable not talking about that. But you may be thinking that if you would like to talk to me about it, if you would like to have more details, our book talks about it quite a bit. There's a whole chapter on kind of the rise of Imperial Athens. So you are welcome to read that. I'd be happy to talk about that. You can even, I don't know, maybe somehow incorporate that into your building of the city, your ideal city. But I just wanted to kind of get that out of the way, so you know that I wasn't ignoring it because I don't think it's important, but just because I don't think it's incredibly necessary for this particular project. So that is my disclaimer. So today we're going to be talking about, or in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the government and social groups of Athens. And so I want to first call your attention to this picture that we have in front of us. So this is a modern day picture. It was taken within the past 5 years. And this is a picture of what's called the Pnyx. You can see this little word right here, Pnyx. And the Pnyx was where the Athenian government met. So they did not meet. So for the meetings of all of the government groups that we're going to be talking about in this lecture, they are not meeting in a fancy building. They are not meeting in a temple. They met outside on a hill that was called the Pnyx. And this is it. It is still there today. I am sure it looked nicer in 460 BCE than it does now. But you can see here there's these steps and this kind of rostra, essentially. So all of the people would gather in kind of this flat area, all of the men, the male citizens, and the speakers would come here to address the crowd and call for votes. So I thought that was a really nice way of kind of visually placing where much of this activity happened. It's still there. You can still go visit it today. You can get up on that rostra, call for a Sicilian expedition, give it a shot, see what happens. So let's talk about Athenian government. It is quite famously, the city of Athens has our first kind of real documented democracy. And in case you didn't know, the word democracy is actually Greek. So the word demos in particular means people. So this is the Greek word. In English, it is often called a deme, D-E-M-E. But so demos just means people. And then the krasi oh, sorry about this. I would stop and go back, but I don't want to lose momentum. I will fix this slide. But you can see the Greek here is kratia. The word kratos means strength. And so krasi basically means power. So democracy is essentially power of the people, or the people are the power. And we see this, like I said, in Athens for the first time. It is, in fact, quite what people call a radical democracy in certain aspects, and we're going to look at that. But it was also not a true democracy in certain aspects, and we will talk about that as well. We're going to talk about the assembly in just a second, but let me just back up here. It doesn't really matter. In the foundation lectures, we left off with Cleisthenes. So the Cleisthenic reforms, the reforms of Cleisthenes in 509 BCE, were truly the ones that put Athens on kind of a democratic foothold. But as I said in that lecture, they weren't complete. After Cleisthenes, there were still other reformers to come along. In particular, in case you are interested, I will never ask you about this guy. There was a guy named Epiphialtes or Epiphialtes. His name starts with an E anyway. And in after the Persian Wars, he came and he gave more power to the assembly. So he's kind of a big guy. And we are going to talk about Pericles in a couple of slides. And he also helped facilitate some more democratic governance. And we'll talk about that when we talk about Pericles. I think those reforms are pretty minor, so I don't want you to worry about knowing them. But I wanted to let you know because I did say that Cleisthenes had some reforms after him. So I wanted to let you know that's the sort of thing. They were pretty minor in the grand scheme of things. But one thing Cleisthenes did do was give a lot of power to the assembly. So the assembly is the biggest, and by biggest, I mean the largest in terms of human bodies, governing body in Athens. The assembly, if this is at all of interest to you, was called in Greek, the word is ekklesia. So we have this word somewhere in English. And of course, now that I'm saying this, I'm like, where do you see ecclesia? But you in some places, especially, in the church, you will see the word ecclesia come up. Ecclesiastical, does that make sense? I don't know. But anyhow, the Greek word for assembly was ecclesia, and this included all adult male citizens. So that's why this is such a radical sort of democracy, that any adult male citizen could participate in the assembly. And what the assembly did was they made laws on any subject. They raised taxes if they, and not by raise like, oh, it's 5%, now it's going to be 7%. It was like, we are going to put a tax upon all olive oil imports. We are currently living in a moment of tariffs, right? So the Athenian assembly would be in charge of something like a tariff. So that quite a bit of power, as we see now. They would supervise spending. So they would say, listen, we want to spend this amount of money to go to Sicily. We want to spend this amount of money to build a temple, this sort of thing. And then they were also in charge of foreign policy, which is wild. And it led to some crazy, crazy moments. So, in particular, like one that comes to mind, though you don't need to know this, I just think it's very interesting. During the Peloponnesian War, Athens got very mad at a city called Mytilene, which was within sailing distance. And so the assembly said, we want to go and kill all of the male citizens of Mytilene. That's how mad the Athenians were at the Mytileneans. And so one day they voted and they said, yes, we are going to go sail to Mytilene and kill everyone on that island, all the men on that island. But then the next day, after they had kind of had some time to cool down, cooler heads prevailed and it came back to the assembly and someone came up and they were like, maybe we shouldn't kill all the Mytileneans. And the assembly was like, yeah, that's a good idea. We shouldn't do it. So they had to send a ship after the first ship to stop this kind of wholesale massacre of one of their neighbors. So that was absolutely possible. Things like this did happen, but that was how their democracy worked. That's how the assembly was often criticized because it was so many people and they could be easily swayed by powerful speakers. So if like on Wednesday you had this very charismatic speaker come up and be like, let's go kill all the Mytileneans, and they would be like, yes, let's do it. But then the next day another good speaker stood up and was like, maybe we shouldn't. They're like, yes, that's absolutely right. So there's a lot of criticism of the assembly for this sort of thing. And the other thing that's so interesting, we don't actually know how votes were cast. It is largely thought that it was a raise your hand situation. So could you imagine so many people and the vote was by hand raising? Like it blows my mind every time I think about it. It could have been something like who's loudest. So it's interesting, but it generally was effective for most things for a little while. And though the assembly could have included up to 30,000 people, that would be the number of adult male citizens in Athens in the 5th century. It could have been 30,000, but probably, and our book argues this, it was probably no more at any given time than 6,000 people. Because, we see this in the States all the time. Some people just don't care about the thing that's being voted on. But also people had to work. People couldn't come to the picnics every single day. They had to be on their farms. They had to go take care of their families. So there was many reasons why people couldn't go. But still, 6,000 people is quite a large amount of people to have like a hand raising vote. But anyhow, so that is the assembly, the ecclesia. So the assembly got power last. They were really the recipients of the later reforms, and they are the first to have power taken away from them when Athens starts to move away from democracy. But this was quite a unique body, and that was it. That was the ecclesia. If you are looking for kind of parallels, one might argue that the House of Representatives in the US now is kind of similar to the Assembly. But note that the House of Representatives is representative democracy. So one person represents a large number of people. In contrast, the Assembly is radical direct democracy. Every citizen, their vote is counted. So not quite the same. Above, I don't want to say above. In addition to the assembly, the ecclesia, is this thing called the boule. This is pronounced boule. I probably should have put a long mark over that E. So if the assembly, if the ecclesia is parallel to the House of Representatives, the Boule would be parallel to the Senate. It is a smaller body, so notice it's 500 male citizens as opposed to 6,000. They are often, as our book, I think our book points this out, they were often kind of the wealthier citizens for whatever reason. This is kind of what we think. They were not everybody could join. They were selected by lot every single year. So if you don't know what I mean, but when I say by lot, just imagine, all of the Athenian citizens put their names into a jar, and the names that were picked out of the jar would be part of the boule. Another way of looking at it, if you are at all familiar with the Hunger Games franchise, which I know a lot of people are, the male citizens were chosen in the same way the tributes were chosen in Hunger Games, but hopefully they were happier to have this job. The boule also was more narrow and more specific because it met much more frequently. So the assembly would meet as needed, which was still pretty frequently. Our book talks about that. I think our book says something like once a month, essentially. Maybe it was once a week, but it was, not every day. But the boule met every day. And let me say that all of the elections in Athens happened on a yearly basis. So the boule would have been elected once a year, and the members of the boule would meet every day. And they met for the running of the city, the more practical things. Um, who's going to do a building project, what's going on with the building project, this sort of thing. So it's a slightly more elite group. It had a little more power, a little more direct control. And as our book says, it has been argued that the Boule acted as a restraining force on the assembly through the way it chose businesses and framed motions, though its continually changing membership would have militated against it achieving any sustained influence. So what this essentially means is that though the Boule could kind of control certain things that the assembly couldn't, had a little more direct impact, it was still a body that changed every single year. So even if there was like a handful of folks who were, say, directing government business towards their own friends and family, that would only last a year, and then they would have to go out. So that is the Boule. This particular body, the Boule, and this is again not something I'd ever ask you about, but in case it's of interest to you, at the end of the 5th century, Athens basically collapses and falls into what's called an oligarchy, they're controlled by tyrants, and the Boule existed in that, retained power in that particular environment. So. I don't know why I'm sharing that. I was just talking about it yesterday. That's why. It's because it's on my mind. I was just talking about the boule. But anyhow, so that would be our more elite democratic body, but still a representative body, essentially. So here I wanted to talk about the jurors because A, it's a really unique feature of the Athenian government, but also we're going to be reading the clouds. Part of the clouds is kind of our like arty section of this module, and it will talk about what jury service was like in Athens. So, as our book says, there was no independent judiciary in Athens. So there weren't well-trained lawyers, there weren't well-trained judges, in the way we do now, right? It wasn't like you had to have specialized legal knowledge to participate in the judicial system of Athens. Instead, the citizen body as a whole took responsibility for enforcing the law, both as judge and jury. And actually, now that we're talking about it, in addition to the clouds, I'm asking you to read the Eumenides, which depicts a law court. So we're going to actually see that in action. So hopefully that will illustrate kind of how Athens judiciary worked. What's amazing is that the Athenians were incredibly litigious. That is like something that we as modern day Americans have in common with them. They were constantly filing lawsuits against one another. They were constantly suing each other, but it was all done essentially by amateurs rather than experts. So the next line says, although the Areopagus still presided over accusations of deliberate murder and sacrilege, most cases were heard by juries of ordinary citizens. So the Areopagus was where murder trials were held. This is this deliberate murder and sacrilege. The murder trial stuff we talked about when we talked about Draco. So that was like the first court in Athens to be established, was a court for murder. So this was kind of an elite court. But most other cases, as the sentence says, were heard by juries of ordinary citizens. So let's say, for instance, someone stole your cow, or someone burned down your house, or someone seduced your wife. You, as an Athenian citizen, could sue that person. You could take them to court and sue for damages. We have many records of these lawsuits. Another thing that often happens is one citizen will sue a general, an Athenian general, or an Athenian leader for doing something wrong in a battlefield situation, which is crazy. And this was all just done. One guy accuses another guy. He takes him to court, and and it's essentially speeches. So one guy will get up and say, I'm going to say Joe Smith because he's my colleague at CSU. Joe Smith burned down my house. This is what happened. This is how much money he owes me. And then Joe Smith would stand up and be like, I did not burn down Courtney's house. That was done by someone else. I wasn't even in Athens at the time. So it would just be speeches like that. And then the jury would vote. So, as we can see here, a roll of 6,000 citizens was drawn up each year, and from these, a jury was selected for each case. So, every year, 6,000 citizens were essentially put into a jury pool, and whenever a case came up, they would choose names, depending on how many they wanted, from that jury pool, and those citizens would have to come and give judgment. As we can see, the more serious the charge, the larger was the jury, with a maximum of 2001. So for a big case, and I do think like the trial of Socrates, for instance, I think the trial of Socrates had about 2,000 jurors. But smaller cases, like, someone crippled my pony, would have something like 500. But that's still a wild amount of jurors, right? So as many of you know, if you've ever had this experience, if you go to trial now, you have 12 jurors, right? 12. And that to me, I've been on a couple of juries. I'm like, this is too many people. Not that I think the system's wrong, but 12 is to get a consensus among 12 people can be very hard. So imagine with 2,000 people. Anyhow, so very big juries. And the reason, as you can see, they had so many is because it would have been impossible to bribe so many people. Jury sitting was a virtually full-time job, with jurors sitting up to 200 days a year. So it was kind of a big responsibility. We will see in the clouds that some people really loved it, some people really hated it. But it was a big part of being a part of the city of Athens. And actually, one of the reforms that Pericles instituted that was very important was paying jurors. So you can see, so let me put it to you like this. Before Pericles's reforms, if you were an Athenian citizen and you were required to sit on a jury for 200 days a year, you would be losing a lot of money because you wouldn't be able to work during those days. You wouldn't be able to, earn any money. So it could have very much encouraged only rich people or poor people selling their seats, this sort of thing. It would have been very difficult for an Athenian citizen of average income to be a juror. It would have been a very big burden, and it's a place where corruption would have been possible. So Pericles recognized this, and he said, we have to pay these jurors in order that every Athenian citizen can fairly participate, can fairly share that burden of the city. So, yeah, so I think it's a really unique aspect of Athens. We don't see it anywhere else. And yeah, so I'm glad that we got to talk about that. So that was the jurors. And then in terms of day-to-day administration of the city, our book suggests, and other, obviously, I mean, this is accurate, there's 600 kind of government posts per year. These were chosen if you were an Athenian citizen. Anyone could fill these positions. I mean, and they covered many aspects of Athenian life, ranging from tax revenue to policing the streets to being the police. And they were chosen by lot. So one year, some random guy would be chosen to be the IRS, whereas some other random guy would be chosen to be the police chief. So, and then it would change the next year. And then there are the generals. Now, the generals, these are the people running the army. So this is not chosen by lot. Notice they were elected by a simple majority. It was always 10 male citizens, and they had both collective control of the military and responsibility for specific campaigns. So this is a place where we do see, and how do I want to put this? Specialization did matter in terms of the military. So for many of the other positions, it wasn't as if you had to be trained in tax revenue to collect taxes. All you had to do to become a tax collector was be an Athenian citizen. But for military, and this obviously makes complete sense, the Athenians were not super comfortable with having just some random guy chosen off the street to kind of lead an expedition against Sparta. So they would elect people with military experience. This was, something that happened. We will see, we're going to meet Pericles in a very short amount of time. And Pericles was elected general. He was elected one of these 10 generals every year for approximately 15 years, like just 15 years. And it was because he was good. So if you were good, if you distinguished yourself as a military person, you would be consistently reelected general. So this was one place where it was an election, but the people who were elected had some experience because who wants to mess around with military? And this last thing is collective control of the military. Basically, in Athens, it's not as if they had conscription, but they did have constant kind of military training of people. And then specific campaigns would be if Athens was sending a force against another city. If they were sending a force against Mytilene, against Sparta, very famously, they sent something against Sicily. One guy would be in charge, sometimes two guys would be in charge of that particular campaign. So that is how that worked. And then here he is. Here's Pericles. So I will tell you that Pericles is amazing. Like hands down, I think he is incredible. I have absolutely nothing bad to say about him. He is wonderful. And I have been in love with Pericles for a very long time. I just learned in the course of putting together this lecture that he was 66 years old when he died. I had kind of conflated him in my head with Alexander, who we're going to be talking about when we talk about Alexandria. And as we all know, Alexander died very young. I think he was 33. And I had always thought that Pericles was around 33 when he died, but he was 66. So he was around in Athens for a very long time. He was alive during the Battle of Marathon, which ended the Persian Wars. But so Pericles was like a military genius. He was a military genius, he was a civic genius, he was a very good speaker. He had, and we're going to talk about it, amazing taste in wives. And to me, amazing. But one other fun fact about Pericles, he was very self-conscious about the shape of his head. No one quite knows what was wrong with his head, but it is well known that he had a strangely shaped head. And so that's how you can recognize him in statues. He is always wearing this kind of helmet, because he was so self-conscious about the shape of his head that he would only let himself be depicted wearing the helmet. So Pericles, as I mentioned just now, he gained success as a military commander, and then he kept being elected as military commander. And in that role, he really took over Athens. He kind of became their de facto president. He was a very good speaker. He was very good at creating alliances. He was just an incredibly just charismatic, powerful person. But he did amazing things for Athens. I mean, not just paying the jurors, but paying other parts of the city. Um, he was truly just amazing. And he was the leader of Athens at its height for a very long time. So the book talks about him quite a bit. Um, yes, yes. And so here is, oh, sorry, we're not going to talk about him. Well, are we? I can't believe I left out a slide. Let me just say it now in case it never really comes up again. He had a, excuse me, one second. He did have an Athenian wife for a while with whom he had a couple of sons. This will be more important when we read his funeral oration. But he ultimately hooks up with this woman named Aspasia, who was not an Athenian citizen. And they formed this amazing power couple for like 15 years. For a very long time. And he is so in love with her and so convinced of her importance to the city that he tries to get her made an Athenian citizen, and they have a child together, and he tries to change the citizenship laws so his child with Aspasia can be considered a citizen. It's a testament to the power of Athenian democracy that that never was allowed to happen. It's also quite sad. Um, but yes, and then ultimately, Pericles, he leads Athens in the first 2 years of the Peloponnesian Wars. But then he dies of the plague at the very beginning of the wars. And it's one of history's great what ifs. Like, would Athens have succeeded for longer? Would it have beat Sparta in the Peloponnesian Wars if Pericles had lived longer and had not been killed by the plague? But he was killed by the plague and it's very sad for me personally. So we're going to talk about him later in the next, and not the next lecture, but in the lecture on his funeral oration, which is an amazing piece of work that we're going to look at. But anyhow, Pericles. You can't talk about Athenian democracy in the fifth century without talking about Pericles. Like I think of him as like their Abraham Lincoln, their George Washington, their JFK. Yeah. So anyhow, that's Pericles. So those are all the great aspects of Athenian democracy. And no matter what I say after this, please know that the triumph of Athenian democracy is truly epic, just absolutely amazing, completely extraordinary. And we as humans are lucky that it happened. But it was not a complete democracy. You may have noticed in all of the slides that I just looked at, I emphasized male citizens. So, male citizens in Athens, though significant, actually represented kind of a minority of the population. And so they governed through a democracy, but their government also covered many people who were not represented. In particular, any non-citizen living in Athens had absolutely no voice in government at all. And so there were approximately 30 to 40,000 male citizens in Athens in the 5th century. There were also approximately, believe it or not, 30 to 40,000 Athenian women citizens, but they had absolutely no rights in their government, none at all. And we're going to see that in the funeral oration. It's very sad. There was also children. I don't feel so bad about this. I don't think kids need representation in government, but there was about 30 to 40,000 children who had no voice in government. They weren't allowed to vote. And then there's this group called the medics. So medics were essentially non-Athenians. These were often tradespeople, artists, craftspeople who lived in Athens, which prided itself on having many people come live there. But medics could not become citizens. There was no path to citizenship if you were not born in Athens from Athenian parents. So if you moved there when you were 25 to become a poet or whatever, that was great. You could live there, but you could never become a citizen, and that means you could never vote or have any say in government at all. And then look at how many enslaved people there were. 100 to 150,000. So more than twice the amount of citizens were enslaved people. These people could be not enslaved. It was possible to buy one's freedom or gain one's freedom, but they would never become a citizen. That was impossible. So that is a huge amount of people who just had no voice at all. There was many lawsuits about slaves, but usually it was how much does someone owe for killing a slave, or was that person a slave at one time? This sort of thing. So we know about slaves because they are in the records, but they never had any rights at all. And if you ever want to talk about, there's this amazing book called Torture and Truth by one of my mentors about what it was like for slaves in Athens. I'd be happy to talk about that. It's truly disgusting. So yeah. So anyhow, these people were not represented by the government. Yes, and this, in fact, so in case you're wondering, this statue is definitely of Vespasian. It's from a model. That's what she looked like. She was gorgeous. She was amazing. Okay, so actually, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm actually gonna divide this particular lecture in half, just so you don't die of YouTube videos. So when we come back, we will talk about the different social groups that made up Athens. So we'll still be in the government and social classes. We will just be focusing on the social classes. So come back for that. It'll be great.